What's up guys, how's it going, and welcome to my monthly build for April 2019. The system I have today, I'm pretty happy with actually, because I was trying to find a balance. I've done quite a few systems that are less than $1,000 recently, and if you'd like to look at a system that's maybe 800 or 900 bucks, look at my monthly builds videos from last month and the month before. This computer is meant to be a gaming PC of course, but it can do much more than that. It's micro ATX, so I'm keeping things in a pretty compact form factor, and it only costs about $1,150.
Excellent!
So here's our lovely array of parts, and as you can see we've got some Cooler Master stuff for the case and power supply. We've got an MSI RTX 2070 Armor gaming graphics card, and that in my opinion is like, if you're gonna spend a decent amount of money on a graphics card, around 500 bucks or so, the RTX 2070 is really the way to go. It's a really good performer. These can range up to $600, but I think the $500 ones are just fine, and the MSI Armor qualifies as one of those. We have, of course, the Ryzen 7 2700. This one has been on sale for as cheap as $220. I got this for $225 just recently. The 2700 comes with a Race Spire cooler, so you get a perfectly adequate and actually decent performing for a stock cooler along with it, so you don't need to worry about spending more money on that. Of course, you can upgrade that in the future. It's going to overclock automatically to 4.1 gigahertz on a couple cores, and of course you can add a better cooler if you wanted to and overclock it in the future, because we're unlocked for overclocking with our B450M Steel Legend motherboard from ASRock. I really like the B450 chipset from AMD because you can still overclock with it, and as long as you get a board that has decent power delivery, and this board does have decent power delivery, then you're totally just fine, even if you're getting like a pretty powerful CPU with 8 cores and 16 threads like the 2700. This one will only cost you about $95 to $105, and it's micro ATX. That's part of my goal for this whole build, was to keep things more compact. Before we get to that though, we have just a single SSD for storage in this system, and that's the Intel 660p, which is actually an M.2 NVMe SSD. This is the 2 terabyte version, but I actually put the 1 terabyte version in the parts list. The 2 terabyte version is a great deal though, about $210, $220 for that, about $110 for the 1 terabyte version, and I wouldn't always say, hey, make sure you get a faster NVMe SSD for a gaming PC over a standard SATA SSD, but in this case, the Intel 660p has actually been the same price per gigabyte, or even a little bit less than like your 1 terabyte SATA SSDs like this SanDisk one. The Intel 660p uses QLC, or 4 bits per cell NAND flash memory, so it's not going to be very good for extended writes. I would not recommend this drive for like a working drive for video editing or anything, but if you're going to spend about the same amount of money on this or this, well then yes, go ahead and get a NVMe SSD. The 660p is a good choice for that. For a memory kit, I grabbed the G.Skill Flare X 2x8 gig kit, 16 gigs total. This is 3200 speed, cast latency 14. This is a really good kit of memory. It's Flare X, which means it's actually made for Ryzen, compatible with Ryzen, so you're guaranteed to get Samsung B dies. These are a bit more expensive though, so down in the video description, I've actually listed different memory that will still work with Ryzen, but if you want to make absolutely 100% sure that your memory is going to work with Ryzen at the speeds that are listed, then consider the Flare X kit. Just look for a good deal on them. If not, go with the kit that I have listed in the video description. Rounding things out, we have our case, we have our power supply, and we have an added fan. Now the case I've listed in the description is the Masterbox Q500L, which is $40. This is the Q500L, which is $60, but the 500L and the 300L are both the same exact external size. So when I contacted Cooler Master and said, hey guys, this just showed up in the mail, but I was actually looking for a Q300, they were like, oh, it's the same size, do you want to just use that? And I was like, okay, so I'm going to be building in this, but bear in mind you can get the Q300, which is about the same size, just doesn't have the compatibility with full-size ATX motherboards like this case does. I'm also not 100% sure what the Q500L ships with as far as fans. I had added a Masterfan Pro 140 to the original build too, because the Q300L only ships with one, and you want to make sure you have one for intake and one for exhaust at minimum. Finally, our power supply is a new series of power supplies from Cooler Master, the MWE 650 Gold. This is 80 plus gold rated, 5-year warranty, black cables. Cooler Master has finally come out with a new series of power supplies. These are also really well priced, so keep an eye out for these if you're looking at like EVGA and Corsair options, because these are very good as well. So those are the parts I'm working with today, guys. I have my trusty screwdriver, so let's get started. All right, so I've just sort of taken this case apart and given it a first look, and my first impression is that I should have gone with the Q500L for this build because this is a full-size ATX case. That's part of Cooler Master's revisions on this, is they've managed to wedge a full-size ATX system in a pretty compact form factor, so good on them for doing that, but I totally should have just gone with a full-size ATX motherboard for this build. But again, that's not my fault because I was originally planning on building the Q300L. We're going to press forward and talk about the case itself. Now, here's the I/O. You've got a couple USB 3.0 and your mic and headphone jacks, as well as a power button. That can actually be repositioned, so it's mounted to the case side right there. You can take it and put it up on the top right there, or you can put it on the bottom right there, or you can put it on the left side right there. Acrylic side panel just kind of tucks in like that, stays in place, and then that's held on by some thumb screws, which I will reapply in just a moment. Opposite side panel is held on by these kind of rubber thumb screws, and I believe that's meant to actually be sort of a foot as well, if it's mounted there, so you can set the system on its side. Once those are removed, it just sort of opens, kind of. Little tab right there. It'll sort of prop itself up, but that easily falls off, as I demonstrated just a moment ago. And then behind there we can see there's actually a good amount of cable management room back here, so that is good. This is also where your expansion drives would go. We've got a couple metal trays here just held on with thumb screws, and those could handle a single 3.5-inch drive each or two 2.5-inch drives each. So 4 SSDs or 2.5-inch drives or 2 3.5-inch drives can fit right there. For accessories, we've got a manual here, thumb screws for either side panel, and then they've given us a baggie of screws and zip ties for mounting anything else up that might need to be mounted. And then you may have noticed sort of a distinct pattern on the dust filters for this case. They are just held on by magnets, so they're really easy to peel off and remove. So, you know, if you want to clean the dust out of them, just pull it off, clean the dust out, put it back on. And you get one of those on the top as well as on the front. And then Cooler Master has also included Paul's hardware versions of those because, of course, they design these cases to go out to system integrators and that kind of thing. So just sort of pointing out, I don't know if they're going to sell these blank ones that you can sort of screen your own printing onto, or if they're going to do a custom shop for those, but you can, you know, make it your own by adding a bit of your own personal flair, like a Paul's hardware logo. So this is our Wraith Spire cooler, which is notably better than the Wraith Stealth cooler that ships with some of the lower end Ryzen processors. But we were unboxing stuff and Joe popped this cable out and I was like, what's that cable for? It looks like it's for the Wraith Max, which is the higher end stock cooler that ships with like an 1800X. But this actually has RGB. You can sort of see there's a ring around it right there. It's got a little plug there at the back to plug in this little cable for. So that's kind of cool. Just sort of a bonus, I suppose. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees so that the AMD logo is facing up, because I've actually had people complain about that in several different videos. There's a couple different ways to do this, but mainly there's 4 screws that connect it to the heatsink itself. I'm going to try to get at those so I can just rotate the whole thing together, because there is a cable that comes out here that's kind of connected up. So there's a top piece that's a shroud here, then there's a lower piece that's actually the fan hub. I'm going to try to take that all out together. Okay, never mind plan A, we're going with plan B, which is to pop the shroud off first, because it's kind of blocking some of these screws. Just a flathead or slot screwdriver around the outside to kind of pry it up and get it off with the little prongs that's holding it down. All right, for anyone trying to do this at home, be careful, because there is an inner ring here that has some tabs on it that snaps into this piece, which you need to reach in there to pull off. You might notice the AMD logo kind of getting a little recessed in there. Just all 3 of these pieces just only sit together when they're actually attached to the base piece. But once those are loosened and up off to the side, you can get at these lower screws. I'll unscrew those. So now the whole top piece comes off, and then look, you can see the beating hard copper slug at the middle of this whole thing, and the bottom of the fan too. So guys, I don't know if this has been done much with this RGB version of this cooler, but if I had known it was going to be this complicated, I probably would not have bothered with this since it's an aesthetic fix. I think I've got it okay without breaking anything, but you might notice there's an inner ring here, there's the LED, and then there's the outer hub, and it's really, really tight to get all that back in there together. And then this inner ring has little tabs that need to push down into little gaps right there, and it feels like there's no room for it. I've got, I think, 3 of them attached now though, and I'm going to try to push this last one in. Famous last words. I did it. It's back together. The only sacrifices were this plastic tab piece that I broke off and the pre-applied thermal paste on the bottom, which I messed up. My recommendation though, guys, for anyone who wants to try this, just don't. Just do it sideways. Alright guys, the build is put together. This one had its share of hiccups along the way, unfortunately. The Q500L is a decent case, I would say, for 60 bucks, but it's not really impressing me. I just feel like there's other options out there for $60 that are more reasonable, that might have tempered glass or some additional features. Build quality wasn't really all there for me either. I feel like for 40 bucks, the Q300L makes a little bit more sense. So that's where I would direct you, especially if you're putting this actual system together. What I'm left with now, despite the sort of configuration that they went with here, I have a big blank spot at the bottom of the system that's just not being used for anything. Power supply could have gone there, then I wouldn't have had worried about the sort of janky mounting of the power supply to the front up here. Screws were not lining up there very well at all, which made it very difficult to mount it up there. Then once I got it mounted and I was trying to plug in the modular cables, which were sticking a little bit, it just felt like I was gonna bend the case or something when I was doing that. So ended up unmounting it to plug in the modular cables. So if you do build in this case, I'd recommend plug in your modular cables first before you install the power supply into the case. That would solve that problem. And then of course there was that AMD CPU cooler attempt that I made to rotate it. It did work. It did come out vertical, so that's nice, I guess. But man, that was more challenging than was expected too. I have more to say about this build. I'm gonna follow up and do some testing on it. For now, that is all for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.